I was halfway through sipping my morning coffee when a full-grown man in business slacks and no shirt came screaming overhead on a zipline, clutching a briefcase in one hand and what looked like a frozen toaster waffle in the other. He shot across my backyard like a malfunctioning superhero, nearly clipped my head, and crash-landed into my hedge with all the grace of a flying raccoon. My dog barked once, looked at me like this isn't normal, and calmly walked back inside. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong. It wasn't a one-off prank. Over the next 15 minutes, 3 more people zoomed past. One of them was Karen, the president of our HOA, shrieking with delight like she'd discovered her inner child, except her inner child was a demon fueled by committee power and passive-aggressive newsletters. By the time the 4th person soared by, grazing the top of my bird feeder, I'd had enough. I walked out front in my robe and slippers, still holding my coffee, only to see what can only be described as a community amusement park assembled overnight. A 100-foot steel zipline stretching from the clubhouse rooftop to a poorly constructed landing pad made of what looked like pool floaties and lawn chairs, and the whole thing ran right over my backyard. I marched straight to Karen, who stood at the base of the zipline wearing a neon sash that said, "Air Traffic Controller." I asked her, politely at first, what in the cinnamon-scented hell this was. She smiled like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "It's a community recreation feature," she beamed. "It promotes wellness and engagement. Plus, it's for the children." I glanced around. No children in sight. Just a red-faced HOA treasurer arguing with a woman who had gotten her fanny pack stuck on the line mid-ride and had to be rescued with a ladder. "That's my backyard," I pointed out. "People are flying over my house." Karen blinked at me like I had said water was wet. "Well, technically, your backyard ends at the 6-foot fence," she said, smirking. "Airspace isn't addressed in the HOA charter. So we considered it communal." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but all I got was the mechanical whir of another zipliner launching into the sky with a whoop. I spent the next hour making phone calls. To the city, a zoning office, a lawyer, even my cousin Lena who works as a systems engineer for wind turbine safety. Everyone said the same thing: the airspace issue was a gray area. The HOA hadn't technically trespassed, but they had definitely built something sketchy, and I wasn't powerless. I just had to get creative. Back at home, I stood in my backyard, sipping my now cold coffee, and watching someone zipline overhead while live-streaming. He shouted, "Like and subscribe," and dropped a granola bar wrapper into my pond. That's when the idea hit me. If they wanted to turn my backyard into an aerial circus, fine. But I was going to be the storm that made the high wire act impossible. Later that night, Lena called me back, curious and intrigued. I pitched her my idea: installing wind machines, discreetly camouflaged, programmed to react every time someone triggered the zipline. "Like a hurricane simulator?" she asked. "Exactly," I said. "Only instead of training astronauts, we're terrifying boomers in khakis." Lena laughed for a solid minute. Then she agreed to help. 2 days later, 3 massive wind machines arrived at my door. Lena came with them, dragging along a laptop, several motion sensors, and a mischievous gleam in her eye. We worked late into the night, setting up the turbines in my yard disguised as abstract garden art. She calibrated the sensors so they'd only activate when the line was in use, and adjusted the power to mimic anything from a gentle gust to a violent crosswind. I called it Operation Windstorm. Lena called it the best use of an engineering degree since we built the potato cannon in college. By morning, everything was in place. The wind machines sat quietly under the rising sun, innocent as garden gnomes. I sat on my patio, coffee in hand, waiting. At 7:14 a.m., Karen launched herself off the zipline for her morning flight like some kind of suburban falcon. The sensors tripped. The turbines roared to life. The wind hit her midair like she'd flown into a jet engine's exhale. She spun, shrieked, flailed wildly, and lost one shoe, which twirled through the air and landed in my pool with a sad little splash. She barely made it to the landing pad, where she stumbled off, hair frazzled, sash twisted, face pale. I didn't say a word. I just waved, coffee in hand, and watched her hobble away like a wet cat. Word spread fast. That day alone, 5 zipliners experienced unexpected turbulence. One guy turned sideways mid-flight and hit the fence like a windsock. Another landed backward into a potted cactus. Someone on Nextdoor posted a video with the caption, "Haunted zipline? Watch Karen nearly get yeeted into oblivion." By evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I could hear the shouting from my yard. Something about unauthorized weather events and property retaliation. I didn't care. My lawyer said the turbines didn't violate any codes. They were on my property, under regulation height, and powered by clean energy. "You're not interfering with the zipline," he'd said. "You're just making the ride more interesting." And oh, it was just the beginning. The next morning, I was woken by the sound of someone screaming, "Oh no, not again!" followed by the familiar mechanical buzz of the zipline. I rushed out just in time to see an elderly man spinning horizontally in midair like a rotisserie chicken before landing sideways into my hedge. He lay there for a second groaning before muttering, "That's it. I'm taking the stairs next time." The turbines had done their job perfectly, again. Operation Windstorm was now a well-oiled machine, and my backyard had become the Bermuda Triangle of neighborhood recreation. Lena came by with a toolbox and a grin. "You're now responsible for the HOA's new unofficial safety waiver," she said, handing me a printed copy someone had uploaded online. In Comic Sans, no less. Apparently, zipline riders were now expected to sign a document acknowledging sudden changes in weather patterns, unexpected gusts, and spiritual rebirth due to midair trauma. We both laughed until she accidentally sat on the motion sensor and triggered a mini wind blast that knocked her clipboard into the koi pond. That afternoon, Karen returned with a clipboard, a tape measure, and what looked like a disgruntled maintenance worker wearing a helmet labeled "Safety Consultant." His name was Steve, and he took one look at the turbines and said, "Well, that's new." Karen, ever the queen of fake authority, began measuring the turbines with great theatrical flair while I stood nearby watering my marigolds. "These," she said, "are a safety hazard and a code violation." Steve knelt beside one turbine and pulled out a small wind meter. After a few test runs and one failed attempt to fly a paper airplane through the gusts, he turned to her and said, "Actually, they're within permissible range. A little spicy, but legal." Karen's face contorted like she'd just bitten into a lemon soaked in betrayal. "What about noise pollution?" she snapped. Steve shrugged. "Quieter than your lawnmower. I've got nothing." Then, to my immense satisfaction, he volunteered to test the zipline himself. Karen hesitated, then nodded. She probably thought a successful run would make me look ridiculous. Steve climbed the launch platform with the steady grace of a man who once wrote parking tickets with pride. He launched himself with confidence, only to hit a precisely timed crosswind that spun him 180 degrees and sent him backwards into the landing pad, where he landed with a heavy thud and a muttered, "I'm getting too old for this." He sat up slowly, helmet askew, hair blown into a shape that defied logic. "I quit," he said, removing the helmet and tossing it to Karen. "You people are insane." Then he walked off, limping slightly, as Karen stood frozen like someone had just unplugged her brain. With her consultant gone and no legal footing to stand on, Karen started to spiral. She launched an aggressive HOA newsletter campaign titled "Combat Backyard Turbulence," where she accused certain residents of weaponizing weather. I responded with a community bulletin of my own, "Weather happens, deal with it," featuring a cartoon tornado wearing sunglasses and a caption that read, "Nature's gonna nature." Lena printed the first 100 copies and handed them out at the mailbox station. We had our allies now. Things escalated further when Karen attempted to sneak in a clause banning all outdoor electronic installations during the next HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but several neighbors had my back and attended with popcorn. When Karen tried to push the vote through, my neighbor Rick, the same guy who accidentally landed in my pond last week, stood up and said, "If we're banning electronics, we should start with her megaphone," referencing Karen's constant loudspeaker reminders about trash pickup. The room erupted in laughter, and the motion died on the spot. But Karen wasn't done. The next evening, I spotted a teenage boy crouched near my turbines. I stepped outside and caught him mid-creep, holding a GoPro and wearing a hoodie that said, "Karen's nephew." He froze like I was a T-Rex that spotted movement. "She told me to film the fans," he said, instantly ratting her out. "She said you were hiding illegal fans." I invited him in for a soda, showed him the control panel Lena had programmed with actual storm simulation data, and asked if he wanted to try flying a drone through the turbulence. 10 minutes later, we had footage of a drone spinning like a blender lid and crashing into a bush. He left with a can of soda, a sense of awe, and the realization that Aunt Karen might be the villain. In the ultimate act of denial, Karen tried rebranding the Zipline. She put up a sign that read, "HOA Wind Ride Experience," with glitter paint and hosted an inaugural thrill day. A few bored teenagers showed up, followed by a handful of local influencers who thought it was an amusement ride. I took full advantage of the opportunity. I set up a table in my yard with bottled water, waivers, and a little sign that said, $5 to land in the wind zone, includes free grass stains. I made $40 that afternoon, plus a business card from a guy who said he did viral stunt marketing and wanted to collaborate. The best part? Karen couldn't stop me. My yard was my yard. As long as I didn't block access to the Zipline or interfere with its operation directly, I could do whatever I wanted with the air under it. And that included welcoming a half-dozen thrill-seekers to their first wind-powered tumble into my flower beds. In a final Hail Mary, Karen called a zoning enforcement officer. But fate, in its infinite sense of irony, sent a city employee named Brent, Lena's ex-husband. They'd ended things years ago, but he still adored her. And when he saw her name on my guest Wi-Fi network, he lit up like a Christmas tree. Karen tried to explain the situation, using words like endangering public recreation and unlawful windification. Brent listened, nodded, and then turned to me and said, "Is that a variable speed turbine with auto-dampening?" I nodded. "Nice work," he said, then turned back to Karen. "Everything checks out. Thanks for wasting my afternoon." Karen's jaw dropped. Brent took a few photos, mostly selfies with the turbines, then left with a wave. Karen didn't say a word. She just walked away slowly, like a villain who'd lost her license to monologue. Meanwhile, Lena and I sat in the backyard with cold drinks, watching the sun set behind our decorative wind machines as one last zipliner sailed overhead, spinning gently in the breeze. It was magical, and we were just getting started. By the end of the week, the zipline had become the most chaotic form of transportation in the neighborhood. It had gone from HOA-approved recreation to full-blown airborne roulette. Riders no longer screamed in delight, they screamed in sheer panic. And yet, like moths to a blender, they kept coming. Karen, desperate to regain control, doubled down. One morning, I woke up to find a sign on the clubhouse lawn reading Skypath, the ultimate HOA adventure. She'd apparently named the zipline and rebranded it as a premier attraction to draw in non-residents for community fundraising. That's when I knew she was no longer just annoying, she was spiraling. The situation officially tipped into absurdity when she brought in a food truck. That's right, a taco truck parked next to the zipline launch pad, offering burritos and harness rentals. Kids lined up to zipline for free if their parents bought 2 quesadillas. By 3 p.m., the line stretched into the street. One guy tried ziplining with a taco in hand. You can guess how that ended. Salsa everywhere. My koi pond smelled like cilantro for 2 days. As the zipline traffic increased, so did my creativity. I introduced Turbulence Tuesdays, where Lena programmed the turbines with randomized wind bursts that mimicked real weather patterns. We had Dust Devil mode, low-pressure chaos, and my personal favorite, sudden nor'easter. Of course, everything was technically randomized and legally within safety threshold. But if those thresholds also happened to create conditions that sent people spinning like confused frisbees, well, that was just nature doing its thing. Karen wasn't amused. She responded by issuing a new HOA ordinance banning any backyard devices that create disruptive atmospheric interference. I responded by sending a letter through my attorney pointing out that the ordinance couldn't be enforced retroactively and that my turbines were already grandfathered in. The HOA legal team tried to argue the turbines counted as nuisance installations, but that didn't hold up when another neighbor pointed out Karen's house played motion-activated opera music from her front hedges every time someone walked by. Apparently, her bushes had serenaded the mailman with Italian arias for years. The HOA was losing credibility fast, and Karen knew it. So she pulled her most desperate move yet. She proposed a rezoning of the HOA charter to classify vertical atmospheric passageways as community property. I nearly choked on my coffee reading that nonsense. It was essentially a fancy way of saying they wanted to legally claim the air above my property. The meeting to vote on it was scheduled for Saturday. Lena and I didn't sit idly by. We prepared a presentation. Not just any presentation, a multimedia exposé. Using drone footage, wind speed charts, and several slow-motion replays of zipline fails, all publicly posted online by riders themselves, we crafted a compelling argument that the zipline was not only poorly maintained but actively dangerous. Our favorite clip showed one of Karen's own friends spiraling sideways mid-ride and losing both Crocs in midair while yelling, "Why is the sky biting me?" The meeting was packed. More people showed up than anyone had ever seen at an HOA vote. Karen stood at the front with her usual clipboard, giving a speech full of words like community enrichment, shared innovation, and a bold new aerial future. I let her finish, then stepped up with Lena and a projector. What followed was 15 minutes of pure carnage. People gasped, laughed, and winced. One woman nearly spit out her soda when we played a clip of Karen herself shrieking, "Make it stop," during a particularly windy descent. When it ended, I simply said, "Do you really want your property value associated with this?" The silence in the room answered for me. The vote to rezone failed in spectacular fashion, with only 2 votes in favor. Karen and her treasurer, who spent most of the meeting icing his ankle from his last crash landing. It should have ended there. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 nights later, during a surprise evening ride under the newly installed Zipline LED lights, a group of thrill-seekers attempted to ride in tandem while holding sparklers. I was in my backyard, working on my koi pond filter, when I heard a loud snap. The kind of sound that's never good when it involves cables under tension. I looked up just in time to see one end of the zipline coil backward like a vengeful snake, sending the last rider veering off course and crashing into the clubhouse's inflatable bounce house, which had, for reasons unknown, also been set up for the vibe. Karen stood frozen near the taco truck, staring at the torn cable and the tangled mess of safety harnesses and glow stick. She muttered something like, "This wasn't supposed to happen," and immediately pulled out her phone, probably to blame me. But the damage was done. The zipline was officially out of commission. The next morning, yellow caution tape wrapped around both ends, with a sign that read "Temporarily closed for maintenance." Everyone knew what that meant. A city safety inspector was called in, and for once, it wasn't Brent. This one was named Sherry, and she didn't mess around. She wore a neon vest, steel-toed boots, and a permanent squint that could shatter your soul. She inspected the line, reviewed reports, and after 3 hours declared it structurally unsound. Karen tried arguing it was a fluke, but Sherry cut her off with, "Ma'am, this is the 5th zipline I've condemned this year. I know a disaster when I see it." Karen didn't argue after that. In fact, she didn't say much at all. She just watched as a team of workers began dismantling the line, piece by piece. Her empire of midair tyranny crumbled by lunchtime. But I didn't gloat, not yet. Because I knew Karen wasn't the kind of person to go down without some kind of flaming tantrum on her way out. That night, a flyer showed up in every mailbox. Karen's final play. She was hosting a community appreciation party the following weekend, complete with a barbecue, bounce house, and a ceremonial last ride tribute. There was a picture of her smiling next to the partially dismantled zipline with a caption that read, "When we fly together." Lena read it twice and muttered, "That woman needs therapy and a Netflix password." But I had other plans for that party. The wind machines weren't going anywhere. And if Karen wanted to celebrate, then we were going to make sure her last ride would be a breeze she'd never forget. The day of Karen's so-called community appreciation party arrived with all the subtlety of a circus train crashing into a marching band. Bright yellow balloons marked every street sign. The bounce house had returned, this time emblazoned with a glittery banner that read, "One last flight." Someone had set up a popcorn machine near the clubhouse, and Karen herself wore a sash that said, "Fearless Leader" in rhinestones. It looked less like a farewell to a failed zipline and more like a desperate attempt to save face by throwing herself a retirement party from reality. I stood in my backyard with a cup of lemonade and watched the chaos build like a slow-moving storm. Lena joined me, carrying a box of wireless remotes and her signature toolkit. She handed me one of the remotes and said, "All systems are green. Let's make this memorable." I nodded, not because I wanted to cause mayhem, but because I wanted to give Karen exactly what she asked for, an unforgettable tribute. The zipline itself, though officially condemned, had been temporarily reassembled under the guise of one final ride. Karen had somehow convinced the inspector to allow a single farewell launch, provided it was under close supervision and no more than one rider. She even rented a confetti cannon, which had been poorly zip-tied to a trellis near the landing pad. Her speech was already circulating through the neighborhood via printed handouts titled Karen's Closing Statement. Page 3 was entirely quotes from herself. People showed up, dozens of them, some out of curiosity, some for the free food, and more than a few because they had popcorn-worthy front row seats to what was surely going to be the most dramatic zipline exit in suburban history. By the time the DJ started playing Wind Beneath My Wings, I knew it was time. Karen climbed the launch platform in slow motion, waving like a homecoming queen on a parade float. She took the mic and began her speech. "Today is not about endings," she declared. "It's about legacies, about vision, about soaring above limitations." I could hear muffled snorts of laughter from the back of the crowd. Her own husband looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, possibly hiding inside the popcorn machine. She clipped herself into the harness, gave the crowd a thumbs up, and shouted, "Let's fly one last time." I hit the remote. The turbines roared to life, not at full force, but just enough to create a perfect cinematic effect. Her hair blowing wildly, the banners fluttering, the confetti cannon triggered prematurely, blasting paper shreds into her face before she even left the platform. The crowd oohed. A few even clapped. Karen launched. For a moment it was almost graceful. She sailed down the line, arms extended, eyes closed in pure theatrical bliss. But then the wind shifted. Lena had timed it perfectly. Just as Karen hit the midway point, a sudden side burst sent her spinning in circles. The wind lifted the edge of her cape. Yes, she wore a cape, and it tangled in her arm. She screamed, not in terror but in sheer indignation, as she twirled like a yard sail mobile, feet flailing. By the time she reached the end, she had lost a shoe, her sash was hanging off one shoulder, and the confetti had stuck to her face with sweat. She hit the landing pad sideways, tumbling off into a bush. The silence afterward was deafening. Then someone clapped. Then more joined in. And soon the entire crowd was applauding, not in admiration but in complete disbelief. Karen emerged from the bush with leaves in her hair and a crooked smile that screamed, "This is fine." She dusted herself off, raised both hands and shouted, "I meant to do that." A few chuckled. Most just walked away, heading for the hot dogs and snow cone machine. Her reign had officially ended not with a bang, but with a comedic spiral and a face full of biodegradable glitter. Later that evening, long after the guests had left and the DJ had packed up, the HOA board gathered inside the clubhouse for an emergency session. I wasn't technically allowed in, but the windows were open, and Lena and I just happened to be tending to my nearby garden with unusually keen ears. Karen tried to spin the incident as a symbolic gesture, claiming it represented the turbulence of change and the wind of progress. But the treasurer, still limping from his last ride and now wearing a wrist brace, wasn't buying it. "You spent HOA funds on LED lights, capes, and a taco cannon," he said flatly. "And we're now being sued by 2 Zipline riders and a taco vendor whose food cart rolled into a pond." The room descended into argument. Karen accused the board of lacking vision. Someone shouted about misused funds. Another demanded an audit. I heard papers rustling and the unmistakable sound of someone slamming a folder shut in frustration. Finally, the board voted. Karen was removed from her position, effective immediately. She didn't even get to finish her rebuttal before someone unplugged the clubhouse microphone. Her final words, cut off mid-sentence, were, "This community needs to APPR," and then silence. The next morning, new flyers were posted around the neighborhood. Special election for interim HOA board. My name was on the list of nominees, but I declined before they could print the ballot. I had no interest in ruling over lawn heights and mailbox paint colors. I just wanted peace, and a lawn not treated like a target zone for aerial snack. Karen moved out 2 weeks later. Rumor had it she took a job with a high-end retirement community as a lifestyle consultant. I could only imagine what chaos she'd bring to bingo night. Meanwhile, the zipline structure was completely dismantled. The launch platform became firewood. The landing pad was repurposed as a community dog park. The bounce house mysteriously deflated and vanished during a particularly windy night, never to be seen again. The new board, made up of actual sensible people, passed a motion prohibiting any future structures above 6 feet without unanimous consent from directly affected property owners. The air above my yard was officially mine again. No more screeching. No more midair taco drops. Just the peaceful hum of wind machines and the occasional flutter of butterflies that had returned now that the shrieking had ceased. Lena started getting calls from nearby communities asking about her turbine design. She considered patenting it, calling the system Karen Breeze. I told her I wanted 5% of the royalties and veto power on the logo. She agreed. One evening, as we sat on my patio drinking lemonade and watching the sunset, she turned to me and asked, "Do you miss the drama?" I looked out over my now serene backyard, where the koi swam lazily and the wind turbines spun gently like satisfied grin machines, and said, "Not even a little." We clinked glasses, toasted to sanity, and watched a single balloon drift into the sky. No zipline required. Peace returned to the neighborhood like it had been hiding behind a curtain this whole time, just waiting for Karen to exit stage left. The zipline was gone. The HOA had been reshuffled with people who didn't talk in buzzwords or try to trademark recreational disasters. And my backyard finally looked like a backyard again. No aerial traffic, no random shoe drops, no strangers crash landing into my azaleas. Just sunlight, grass, and the gentle hum of wind machines spinning lazily like they, too, were finally relaxed. The new HOA board worked fast. Within a week, they revised the charter, adding a clear clause stating no installations could extend over private property, vertically or otherwise, without written consent. They called it the Sky Clause, and I had to admit it had a nice ring to it. Lena laughed when she read it. "You turned turbulence into legislation," she said, raising her coffee mug in mock salute. I toasted her back. We had done it. The backyard wars were over. But the story didn't end with silence. No, something unexpected happened in the aftermath. Karen, astonishingly, came back. Not to live, thankfully. Just to visit. It was about a month after she'd moved out. I was trimming a hedge when a suspiciously shiny sedan pulled up in front of my house. Out stepped Karen, dressed not in a cape or a sash this time, but in a conservative blazer and wedge heels. She carried a box. It wasn't ticking, so I let her approach. She cleared her throat like she was preparing to address a room of donors. "I came to offer an olive branch," she said, holding out the box. I raised an eyebrow and took it cautiously. Inside were 6 muffins, blueberry, I think, and a handwritten card that said, "No hard feelings, right? Best of luck with your fans." I couldn't tell if it was passive-aggressive or genuine. Maybe both. The muffins were dry, but the gesture was bizarrely human. Karen explained, in her usual roundabout way, that she was starting over. She'd launched a new business. A bakery. And the theme? Ziplining. That's right, she named it Scone to Fly. She even showed me a mock-up of the logo, which featured a cartoon muffin clinging to a wire for dear life. It was so ridiculous I actually laughed. She looked pleased, maybe the first genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. She didn't stay long. Just enough time to awkwardly pet my dog and mention that she was learning to let go of control-based leadership patterns. I didn't know if she'd read a self-help book or joined a cult, but she seemed slightly less insufferable than before. She got in her car, waved, and drove off. I stood there holding a half-eaten scone and wondering if I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Meanwhile, Lena's wind machine design had taken on a life of its own. After a video of Karen's final ride went semi-viral on TikTok, captioned "Suburban Air Rage" and set to dramatic opera music, several tech blogs picked up the story. Lena got emails, then phone calls. A small drone security company offered to license her control software. Within weeks, she was designing a new version of the system specifically to deter low-flying delivery drones. She named the project Karen Be Gone, and yes, she gave me 10%. The two of us decided to celebrate by throwing a party. Not a fake appreciation event. A real one. Just a few neighbors, some barbecue, and no airborne nonsense. We set up some lawn games, grilled burgers, and invited the whole block. It turned out to be the most relaxed, joyful gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. People brought lawn chairs. Kids chased bubbles instead of getting harnessed to pulley systems. A few guests asked about the wind machines and whether they were still active. I smiled and said, "Only if provoked." That night, Lena surprised everyone by ziplining into the yard. Not from the old platform, of course, that was long gone, but from a much smaller, temporary rig we'd set up just for fun. She wore a wedding dress. That's right, Lena got married that evening. Her fiancé, a kind and quiet meteorologist named Bryce, officiated the ceremony himself and kissed her under a canopy of wind-powered flower petals. The turbines had been reprogrammed just for the occasion, creating a slow, graceful breeze that made the whole scene look like something out of a dream. The guests were floored. Nobody expected a wedding, least of all one that used turbulence as stagecraft. Afterward, Bryce told me he first met Lena during the HOA chaos when he'd come by to ask about the odd wind patterns interfering with his weather station. I realized the wind machines hadn't just disrupted zipliners, they'd blown 2 very smart, very nerdy people into each other's lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. As things settled down and summer turned to fall, my yard became something of a local landmark. Not officially, of course, but people talked. New neighbors asked about the famous wind garden. One family asked if they could take graduation photos under the turbines. Someone even made a short documentary about it for a film school project titled Breezing Past Boundaries. I watched it once. It had dramatic music, slow-motion footage, and a voiceover that made it sound like I'd fought a war instead of a woman with too many lanyards. Eventually, I turned off the turbines. Not forever, just for the season. They'd done their job. The airspace was clear. The battles were over. I even installed a bench near them, surrounded by lavender and low lights, so I could sit in the evening and just listen to the quiet hum of nothing happening. That, more than anything, felt like victory. I thought about Karen sometimes. Not in anger, not even in annoyance. Just curiosity. I checked her bakery's website once. The design was chaotic, the font choices questionable, and the online store sold muffins with names like the Freefall and Blueberry Backflip. Reviews were mixed, but she was trying. And sometimes that's more than you can expect from people. So there I sat, in my windless garden, sipping hot coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky above my reclaimed backyard. No zipliners. No tacos raining from above. Just me, my dog, and the knowledge that if the wind ever needed to blow again, I had the button ready. But for now, peace was enough.